One of the things that I found in the research was that globally, we don't have consistent definitions of what an emergency is and when we need to use declarations of emergency. And when we abuse the word emergency or crisis, it then means that in terms of procurement especially, everything then can be subject to emergency procurement, which again, shortened time pressures, lack of transparency, increased risk of integrity failings. That idea of, making any little discomforts in society an emergency is problematic, and it has real implications for corruption and transparency.
The main challenge there is the finance part and also the management part, because it's something we didn't know will happen. Because it simply means in an interim you need to also manage how the timelines for delivery will be dealt with, how the entire project, put that emergency project scope. So you need to think outside the box within maybe an hour to come up with a contingency plan for it to be implemented.
There's always an influx of money that is extra budgetary to deal with, an emergency. So South Africa, we've had recent floods in KwaZulu-Natal, the pandemic, so much money was pumped in from different sources to actually address that. So the pressure to spend and having a lot of money, and the pressure means that procedures are shortened. So you can't have the same kind of procedures that generate transparency. So transparency kind of goes out the window, and that means that where there's no transparency, things are opaque, then shady deals happen.
The suppliers also know out there that it's an emergency situation. They then take that and they exploit it to their advantage, where they then push up their prices. In most instances, prices are pushed up, but they also in some places will deliver inferior quality goods and services. So if we're having a flood disaster and we're procuring blankets or something for the citizens, they'll give you poor quality blankets. And because it's an emergency situation, you don't have time to say, take it back, I want it now to be exchanged for a better quality, because you have people that are looking at you that I need and want of something for tonight. So suppliers are aware of that, and that's what they are exploiting.
Government tend to relax and depend on the NGOs, like the care of the givers and all that, because if you can see, they are always, anywhere where there's a disaster, they know they are there. So government must not actually wait for NGOs to come on board. They must always have contingency plan for emergencies. Even if this risk is not happening now, in the future or any time it might happen.
Countries need to have two things: a crisis preparedness plan, and also they need to have a crisis procurement plan. So having measures that they put in place saying, when we have a crisis, this is what we do A, B, C, and D. Emergency procurement or crisis procurement usually has some level of planning around it, but not in enough detail. So I'll give an example. New Zealand had a crisis or a pandemic readiness plan, and they had one of the best outcomes when it came to with the global pandemic, because they had a plan in place, but many countries don't.
Emergency procurement leads to corruption because suppliers are aware that we are operating under the emergency crisis mode, where we haven't gone to the market and tested the market to get 3 quotations, and they also then tend to exploit that, where they push their prices up. So example, during COVID-19, when we wanted to procure sanitizers, they knew because the demand was high in the market, everybody was rushing around for sanitizers. They then pushed and marked up their prices higher. And we had no other choice but to procure because we needed it. And so National Treasury stepped in, and then they put in guidelines in terms of how much we must pay for a litre of sanitizer, and then they gave us accredited suppliers to utilize. When we receive bid documents, we analyze and check prices. In some instances, you'll find certain suppliers that have quoted exactly to the cent, to the T in their pricing schedule, and that's a red flag that they've sat down together and they've indeed colluded. Another instance is where we will pick up is that on your standard bidding documents, where we have the addresses of the suppliers listed, you will find sometimes the same handwriting. So that's also something that I've picked up.
One of the things the future researchers need to look at is to map where we are with procurement data, especially globally, across countries that are struggling, which is many countries. So we don't know, in many countries, we don't know what data is collected, and we don't know what the data gaps are. We need to think about, how do we plug those gaps? What's the easiest way? What can we leverage on to make sure that procurement data is collected, it's used for making decisions that are evidence-based?
COVID has, for me, touched us as a country, as the world as a whole, and showed us how we need to make sure that we still bond together as one family, and how we should be united from a government perspective, from the private sector perspective, when these kinds of situations come, because I think it hits the whole broader society and communities at large. And I think for me, the message it left was, I think our sense of Ubuntu should be a bit more stronger and better in terms of how we react and what measures we put in place.